Here we are, Alejandro Varela. I'm so excited to have you here on the Podstack, the Substack podcast. It's like such a joy to be talking about this book that I haven't gotten around to talking about with you since it came out. This came out in 2023, yeah? The People Who Report More Stress.
Correct.
So we're going to talk about your short story collection, The People Who Report More Stress today. But in fact, you have just apprised me of the fact that I missed out on because I'm not on social media, that you have a third book coming out, a second novel. So I hope to talk about that as well. We're talking about your middle book, not your most recent book. But this is a fabulous book. I'm super happy to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here as well.
A delight.
Um, shall I start with a bit of a reading?
You shall, but let me also intro you to those who are listening, those who have and haven't, gotten a chance to familiarize themselves with your work. This is in this other box, Alejandro Varela, who is based in New York, physically, mentally, spiritually based in New York. His work has appeared in The Point, fantastic magazine, also Boston Review, Harper's, The Rumpus, The New Republic, among many other wonderful publications. You were a 2019 Jerome Fellow in Literature, and you are still an editor at large at Apogee, right? Awesome, cool. Um, and your graduate studies were in public health, which is swiftly going to become very, very germane as we talk about this book. Um, Wonderfully, your debut novel, The Town of Babylon, if you could hold that up, Alejandro, so the viewing audience can see. That novel that Alejandro is holding was a finalist for the 73rd National Book Awards. Welcome again. And what a great bio. My friend, can you please read a selection from this collection of short stories?
I will. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to read from a story called Carlitos in Charge, which was published in 2019 in Harper's. And I'm going to read a little bit of the introduction. I was sitting in Midtown by a dry fountain, making a list of all the men I'd slept with since my last checkup, doctor's orders. Afterward, I would head downtown and wait for Quimby at the bar alongside the early drinkers. I'd just left the United Nations after a Friday morning session, likely my last. The agenda had included resolutions about a worldwide ban on plastic bags, condemnation of a Slobodan Milosevic statue, sanctions on Israel, and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in El Salvador. Except for the proclamation opposing the war criminals' marble replica, everything was thwarted by the United States and a small contingent of its allies. None of this should have surprised me. Some version of these outcomes had been repeating weekly since World War II. I'd been working at the United Nations for a little over a year, and in that short time, I'd had sex with the South Korean ambassador, the spokesman for the Swedish mission, an Irish delegate, a Russian interpreter, an Iraqi translator, the assistant to the deputy ambassador from El Salvador, an Armenian envoy, the chief of staff for the Ukrainian prime minister, the vice presidents of Suriname and the Gambia, a cultural attaché from Poland, the special assistant to the special assistant to the Saudi ambassador, the nephew of the ruling party's general secretary of Laos, a distant cousin of Castro, a film director from Mauritania, countless low-level staffers, a few guides, a half dozen tourists, and Brad. William Mycroft Quimby. The other students called him Billy. To me, he was Quimby, sometimes Quim, the PhD student who led my section of Comparative Government 245. Cuba is in Finland, but neither is Finland Cuba. Quimby was a smart guy who came across as even smarter because his English was high register and thickly accented. And he was authentically Irish, unlike the third generation Catholics I'd grown up with, whose ethnic pride consisted of tattoos of shamrocks and pots of gold along their necks and ankles. In phenotypical ways, he reminded me of my friend's dads back home. He had dark hair, also thick, and a knotted face. Quimby was an academic, but he could have been a middleweight boxer, a boxer who gave me attention I wasn't accustomed to. He also had a gorgeous, uncircumcised cock, it too thick. That made me want to know him better, but we drew the line at office hours. I hadn't seen Quimby for almost 20 years when I ran into him at Whole Glory, one Friday about 15 months ago. The red bulb lighting made it difficult to be certain, but when he walked past the first time, I knew him. The second time, I knew it was from college. The third time, a rush of blood inspirited me. Quim! I shouted. He stared at me momentarily, then a moment longer. Wednesday afternoon, I said. Your basement office? NAFTA schmafta, can you hear the world's laughter? Charles in charge? Is that you? Holy shite. I barely recognized you with that mustache. How in the heck are you? Before I could respond, Quimby set his pint down onto the small table and joined me. It's been ages, he said with a glassy stare. What a truly magnificent surprise, Charles in charge. Fine as ever you are. Carlitos is my given name. Carlitos Doritos, the other kids used to call me, one more undesirable way in which I stood out. In middle school, I began demanding that my family address me as Alex P. Keaton, but my dad kept mispronouncing it Alice, which my siblings seized upon, so I settled on Charles in Charge. This was the title of a sitcom that starred Scott Baio as a young heartthrob who nannies three children while going to school and juggling a prolific love life. I was drawn to the show because of Baio's, relationship with his best friend Buddy, played by Willie Ames, a one dimensional, albeit sagacious buffoon. Their camaraderie and affection were genuine and subtle in ways that none of their acting ever was. The slapstick humor struck me as either repressed or coded desire. Frankly, I didn't understand how the show made it onto network television. Carlitos? Sister Susan, my sixth grade teacher, called out. But instead of present, I responded, Charles in charge. Is that Mexican? She asked, peering up from the attendance sheet. No, I said, it's syndicated.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Oh, I love it so much. Yeah, I feel like a kind of a good subheading for that story would be cruising for human rights. But we'll get into that more. I look very much look forward to it. But actually, for to kick us off here, Alejandro, I really want to zoom in on those public health graduate studies mentioned in your bio, just because, like this is a both a title and a cover that like really clearly indicate, I think, ingeniously indicate what's going on in this book. Um, which is basically kind of broadly stated that like uncharitable thinking, bias, stereotyping is a public health crisis, or put another way, like this sort of like a bigotry or lack of generosity, both unconscious and conscious, are about as bad for the lot of us as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or living downstream of a nuclear power plant. So, I think it's like becoming increasingly like widely accepted and understood that like racism, sexism, right? Like these biases, the isms are actual like public health issues and like cause substantial kind of duress, mental and physical, on those who are experiencing them. I'm curious, can you speak more to the kind of like admixture of like lived experience and public health studies that like I think pretty clearly went into making such a convincing case for this. I hate to call it a thesis. I'm okay calling it a thesis. A lot of people are like, oh, I mean, you can still have like a novel or story of ideas. I don't know, but let's just say this sort of this idea. What went into kind of stating that in fiction for you?
Yeah, great question. I am perfectly fine with the use of the word thesis in this case. In all of my work, I do have a bit of a sort of social science brain, and
Yeah.
it's hard for me to disentangle the academic and the research from the art. And listen, above all things, animals and humans are animals, are social beings. Okay, we are social entities. And it is in our nature to want to interact with one another. And I believe we live in a time and in a place where systems, socially constructed systems, whether it's capitalism, whether it's racism, transphobia, homophobia, you name it, they prevent us from socializing naturally. We would otherwise.
Mm.
And that socialization, that ability to treat differences as simply that, differences, but not barriers, that keeps us healthy. When those differences become barriers, barriers to interaction, barriers to health, barriers to success, barriers to happiness, then our health fails as a society.
Mm.
And so I, the day-to-day sort of indignities that come with discrimination and prejudice are miserable and they add up. It's death by a thousand cuts, right?
Right.
It's like not they're not structural forces, but the structural forces lead to that. It's ultimately the things that keep, to use a sort of very black and white example, black and white Americans um, so economically disparate.
Yeah.
Those forces trickle down, right? So if you keep a population impoverished and then they live out the consequences of that poverty, and then you point to those consequences to say that is why that group deserves to be isolated and mistreated, then it becomes this sort of perpetual cycle. Um, but I have had, kind of, I'm making a career a little bit about writing how you can do everything that you're told to do and achieve success and still find yourself facing those indignities. They're different, and you have buffers. You can pay for a massage and you can take a vacation and you can intellectualize the indignities. They're still there chipping away at you, and they affect everyone. The 1% in this country is unhealthier than the 1% in every other sort of
Mm.
industrialized nation.
Right.
So Elon Musk's counterpart in Japan or in France or Sweden is healthier than he is and
Oh,
will
okay. Yeah.
will live longer on average. Okay. And so it affects everyone. Obviously, Elon is doing just fine, but it affects everyone. And so those are the sorts of things that I like to write about how our differences create barriers that then make it difficult for us to socialize. Because if you walk around all day long fearing what people think about you, coveting what they have, not trusting their intentions, triple locking your doors, um, wondering if people are thinking that you are judging them, all of those things, that's like, that becomes a kind of a default way of being. And
Mhm.
that makes your cortisol, your stress hormone, just, sort of tick up a little bit. And the stress hormone cortisol exists for you, the stress response that is exists for you to outrun a lion in the savannah. It exists for you to, deal with the birth of your child, a big speech you have to give in an auditorium. It is not meant to be activated for you to walk from your home to the grocery store. And when it is activated, then all of these other systems shut down in your body and the wear and tear moves faster. Because when you're out running a lion, you don't need to ovulate. Your skin doesn't need to grow, like sort of replenish itself. The blood sugar doesn't need, it's all of these forces that sort of like these systems in your body shut down or get interrupted. And your body can handle that once in a while, but not every day, all day long. And so that's why in the United States, we have a lower life expectancy than the other rich nations of the world, because we have massive hierarchy in our society that makes it so that we don't trust. We are never at peace when we're walking down the street. And the communities where you would find in the US people who say they are at peace every day, they are healthier than we are.
Mhm. I mean, right, like it's so because I mean I think that the thesis that your book presents in part is like it's totally incontestable. Like I've experienced like it's just kind of like if you are in an environment that is hostile to your corporeal style, whatever, if you want to use the Judith Butler speak, or just like your being, right, the way you're showing up, the way you look, it is like just like it is like an abrasion, that kind of is just kind of where it's scraping away, just as you're saying, like at your soul's durability almost, so of course, yeah, that is something I've experienced firsthand, and I know many people have, in different ways. But I guess this is my follow-up question, right? Is like, so what I love so much about really good fiction, right? Especially fiction of ideas. If we want to classify this, like at least sort of partially in that category, it's like fiction, the fiction of ideas also contravenes itself. It also is like, hey, like, you know, this is what is true, right? But here is another idea that kind of challenges that or troubles that, whether to strengthen what I'm saying, right? Or to, just like raise more questions. And so the thing I love, about so much about this collection is like we'll talk more about aspiration in the middle class and capitalism as its own sort of these forms of degeneracy, I guess, mental and physical. But there's also, I'm thinking of the like far left dating app, the leftist dating app, where you have this main character, right? The story sort of unstated protagonist who's going on these dates, and it's like he's talking to all these guys, and every single date, right? Like a dude saying something that betrays the, horrid bad politics TM, and like whether they disagree on Israel and Palestine or they disagree on, the prison abolition or whatever, these sort of like major planks in the platform. And the story, I think, is not saying that this guy being kind of like almost like rigidly, almost like demagogic, almost like you have to agree with me on all of this or else is the way to be, right? I think the story is almost kind of like like troubling or challenging how the main character is moving through the world. And you could totally say that I'm wrong here, but I'm wondering too about like if we're talking about collectivism, right? And if we're talking about embracing difference, and what is the sort of like what is the kind of through line here, right? Like how do we like, or how do stories like that, or how do you feel about embracing difference while also like not sticking too closely to a certain way of being, a certain way of thinking that can lead to another form of rigidity?
So one of my biggest frustrations is when people say, well, if you're a socialist or if you are an anarchist or a communist or some sort of more leftist ideology that believes in society and community over the individual, right? Or
Yeah.
believes we should have a better balance between collective and individuality. They're always like, well, then why do you like drive a car? And like, why are you enjoying the trappings of a capitalistic society and then also bemoaning its consequences or its failings? And I'm like, because that's where we are. Like, that's where we
Yeah.
were dropped in. Like, it would be so convenient for you if those of us who disagreed with the way society is structured lived just picked up and moved off the grid. It would be so convenient because then you'd never hear our complaints. You'd just be able to, and not everyone has the freedom to do that. Not everyone can pick up and leave the grid. And so we kind of have to live here. And so to me, it's a little bit like the suburbs. The suburbs is like people picked up and left the grid in a way. And we're like, I don't want to deal with crime and rats and this and that. And I want more space. And I'm like, well, who wasn't able to leave? And
Mhm.
whose escape was facilitated by government loans and whose weren't? And so yeah, I don't I I guess I feel like what you said at the beginning about how um oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. Is that allowed to happen on a podcast?
It's allowed to happen. Yeah, I have a see all the time. The leftist dating app, and he has this really like,
Right.
yeah,
So I was like, we're all full of contradictions. And I think it's
yeah,
and we can embrace them. And we can
yeah.
say, this is a contradiction that I don't love about myself. And I wish I lived in a place that facilitated me not having to engage and indulge with this. But this is where I am. and I'm not going to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. And so I'm going to bemoan my circumstances and I'm going to do what I can to change them, but also from time to time walk my walk and
Sure.
live a little bit by example and commune with people who also live by example and in the hopes of like, some sort of ripple effect. I That particular story, Comrades, came to be because I was with two friends of mine, um, uh, one queer, one straight, and they were on their apps. And on Friday nights, they were and both single, and they would come over and we would swipe through their. They were like, "Help me! What do you think of this guy and this guy and this guy? What do you think of this guy?" And so, and I remember things like, "Oh God, this guy sounds really broy, and this guy sounds like he's maybe a little racist, and this guy sounds a little conservative, and this guy." And I got to thinking, wow, I met my partner when I was in college,
Mm.
and I didn't have the same checklist for what makes for a good partner.
Yeah.
And we kind of grew together, and we had the freedom to do that because we started so young. But
Yeah.
when you're middle aged, you really don't want to start from scratch. You don't want to be like, okay, I'm a full on commie lefty, and I'm going to marry, I don't know, whoever, like some sort
The
of,
male Amy Coney Barrett.
right,
Arnold Coney Barrett.
Sam Alito, right?
Yes, Sam Alito. That's who that is.
And I hope that we have great conversations and great sex and that he changes over time and maybe I'll meet him in the middle and then we'll blah, blah, blah. People don't have time for that. So I can empathize. But at the same time, I was thinking, wow, like it's so much harder to date the older you get because you do get rigid and you are less forgiving. And maybe we're wrong for that. Maybe we should be more forgiving. So then I really delved into it. I imagined myself single in middle age and being like, I am not starting from number one. I'm going to
Mhm.
pull out all of the people. Let's start with all of the isms, right? And so, like,
Right.
if you're a Zionist, I probably am not going to date you, move on. If you don't support public schools, I'm not going to date you, move on.
Mm.
And so that's what this guy's going through. He's trying to rule out all of the possible people who would disagree with him so he can just sort of hit the ground running, as he says. And and lo and behold, what he finds is like when he finds his dogmatic equal, he's really off-putting and it's sort of not a way to live. And
Yeah.
so he's like, maybe I can compromise a little. Granted, he's not like rushing over to Tinder or whatever it is. He's still on the lefty app, but he's like, maybe I'm going to compromise a little. Maybe this person who had this like complicated stance on Palestine, maybe they just need a conversation. Or it may, he doesn't even come to that realization, but the story does for him. And so I think that's important. If that's what separates in some ways fiction from like science writing, I wouldn't go so far as saying nonfiction. Like I'm not building a case for a particular. Like I'm not saying this is the path to collective liberation. I think what I'm saying is what is collective liberation and like what are the many different like roads to get there
Yeah.
and so it's in fiction or in writing it would be pretty boring if all the characters were perfect
Yeah.
and you disagree with them and you didn't see them grow or evolve or have contradictions. And so some of that was just writing technique. It was like, okay, this person can't be infallible. He has to.
Right.
And so often my narrators or my characters' flaws are they are like annoyingly preachy or self-important. But so much so I think that they become endearing.
Totally. Well, and I think the beauty of that story, right, is it's like, it ends with Matt, whatever, the UX developer who he didn't meet on the app, who he's meeting through this guy who he apologized to for being really kind of dogmatic around, the previous conversation. And it's not that like Matt is utopian. It's like, oh wow, well, Matt is the brighter future. It's just that Matt is more of an enigma, more of a question mark. And I think like what I so loved about that story was that it seemed to be saying no one can be reduced to a politics, quote unquote. And maybe just as you said, maybe we are, we are over determining collective liberation when we insist that a series of boxes be checked, as opposed to, right, like, this being emergent or a kind of a becoming a condition of the collective. Like we were like figuring things out. Yeah, that's I think what some of the best fiction does. And so that's what I really, really loved about the story.
I
And
would
oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I would add it's even just a bad organizing strategy. Like to be strategic
A
is something
really,
else.
yeah.
Partner with people that you agree on three-quarters of what,
Hmm.
three-quarters of the agenda, and you each get what you need to move forward. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes even in a partner, I'm beginning as I age to believe sometimes that partner doesn't have to be your equal in every category. I think, are they there to support you and do you support them? And do they allow you and give you what you need in order for you to move forward? And do you do that for them? That might be the most important sort of, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, actually, that that leads really well into my next question, which is in fact about Carlitos in charge. And we're talking about, right, like how partnership can like change people over time, right? And how like maintaining, a hard line on X or Y issue might be deleterious to a relationship or deleterious to, as you're saying, like organizing liberation, kind of the broader picture or the bigger picture rather. Carlitos in Charge actually takes some of these themes and builds them out, I think really beautifully. You talk about one of my favorite, well, kind of current themes, which is the commingling of desire and politics.
Mm.
I love this story, kind of like one of the stipulations of the story could be, hey, maybe there are, like Iranian nuclear warheads aren't headed towards us right now because someone gave great head, to someone else in like one of the lobbies of and it's kind of this sort of like sexual comedy, right? Where, you've got Carlitos and he's working at the UN and it is as much the UN as it is a 24-hour bathhouse. And it's funny, right? But it's also like it's also very much about, it reminded me of the Amir Srinivasan essay where she talks about and you get into this as well, very much in other stories, the like desire and prejudice in desire, and like like there are some just like openly super racist bios, super misogynistic, like bios on Grindr, and other kind of like hookup apps. And Srinivas asks, like, well, should we examine what's going on here? Like, is desire political fundamentally? Is it a brute fact? Could we kind of interrogate ourselves about this? And in Carlitos in Charge, you're like, let's like amp this up and make it full on political. Like, let's talk about who he's like, what ambassadors and what, counselors he's sleeping with to like get these deals through. And in fact, this is sort of how the story ends up playing out. And I'm just curious, like, can I get from you your kind of frank and unfiltered take on how desire, like, and desire, pleasure, the whole kind of gamut shapes policy in the great bathhouse that is our global commons?
Great question. I was thinking about all of these things. I haven't read the essay, by the way, that you just referenced, but I was thinking about all of these ideas and themes when I was writing the story, and primarily that it's not an accident that white supremacy, which influences how you and I look into a mirror and judge ourselves, right? Everything from the shape of our nose to the color of our hair and eyes, like everything, the shape of our bodies. There are ideals, and they tend to be modeled on sort of European ideals and Western European ideals. And that is effectively how the world order was established, right? Who were the empires? Where did they come from? What was the literature that became? I saw this wonderful uh, clip on Instagram. This comedian whose name I can't remember, and she was saying, you know how Shakespeare is like so great, and like, how did that come to be? Isn't that wonderful? And he's like, well, yeah, you take control of the entire world, and then you require all of the students to read his work.
You
And
just
then,
originate the language.
right, right. And so this is not to knock down Shakespeare. It's just that who controls the narrative?
Sure.
And the people who have been controlling the narrative for a long time are still controlling global order as well. They're doing it at Davos. They're doing it in the White House. They're doing it um, in Rome right now. They're doing it um, at the UN for sure. And I wanted to write about that. It's
Yes.
nothing infuriates me more than to see these votes in the UN where it's like 220 countries to four. And because of who those four are, the bill doesn't pass, or the law or the idea doesn't pass. And it's infuriating.
Yeah.
And I don't think so. Of course, I imagined that at the UN, the Americans, you hate them, but then you're also like, how do I sleep with that guy? He's so hot. But it's because he's powerful, right? And it's because he controls things. And as much as you hate and distrust where he comes from and his ideas and beliefs, the moment he pays you any bit of attention, you melt, right? And so that is what I was trying to kind of dissect a little bit, that you had this really intelligent, theoretically this intelligent person, this narrator who knew what was happening there at the UN, and they let themselves be bamboozled by Brad,
My
tall,
brat.
tall
Yeah.
Brad, yeah. And and I think, yeah, that is for me an analogy of everything from like who invaded what continent and at what time. It's like, okay,
Mm.
let's be welcoming and friendly and trust first, and then you have people like, kind of stab you in the back. And I think that is what empires have been doing to indigenous populations in this world for a very long time, and to mostly everybody. They're a handful of people who control almost everything. And yeah, and we saw that, by the way, at the inauguration in the United States. It was maybe one of the most uh, honest, but also difficult images to see the heads of all of these companies sitting in front of the representatives, closer to the president than the elected officials. And I think that said it all about who we are and how we work.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that, like there is a yeah, there's absolutely a sense here in which like the distillation of these kinds of like geopolitical dynamics of imperialism, conquest, colonialism, the subjugation of people, it plays out a kind of, not to be Freudian here, but I think your book makes this point as well, sort of unremittingly, and like these sort of like top and bottom dynamics, right? Like there is a sense in which like I think what's so funny but also so accurate about this story and so interesting to me too is they're like you can find in these kind of sexual liaisons and these encounters a replication of, just as you said, what's happening in the real world. It's like, damn it, Brad got one over on me, right? And I think it's that like it's this the fact that Brad, like, why are you given to, like you being the kind of collective you here? I don't know who I'm positing, but why is one given to melt when Brad comes on to you, right? Like because Brad is sort of this in this position of power. He occupies this whatever, like he has this phenotype, he has this stature, but it's also like, if we're getting into sort of like the realm of kink and this and that, like where do the politics stop and where does the desire start, right? Like it's such a why is it such a useful heuristic to talk about this in carnal terms, is maybe what I'm asking you.
Mm.
Like, because it can't, it's not just that like, and I know you're not saying Brad is a horrible piece of garbage imperialist and everyone is his victim. It's so much more complicated than that only.
Brad is also a cog, right?
Brad is
And,
all exactly.
and also
Exactly.
Brad and Carlitos, I think there was like genuine momentary hope that it was like and I believe it started as a good relationship or had the potential to be a
Mm.
relationship. But ultimately, Brad was more concerned with power, and I believe that happens in relationships too, especially
Yeah.
relationships with barriers between them where there is discordance, whether it's racial or class based or gender or you name it. And so there is, there's an unevenness there. And given the chance to assert themselves or to hold on to power or to aggrandize them, they're going to take it. And that was sort of what I was getting at, is that nothing was more important to Brad than power. And frankly, I don't know that for Carlitos, had they been given the opportunity, it wouldn't have been the same.
Right. Yeah.
But uh, but yeah, I didn't go
Yeah.
that far with the story because that would have been even more complicated. I would have wanted to address there is I believe, a genetic drive towards collectivity, but I think there's also add to that a cultural drive. There are some of us come from communities where collectivity is more important and
Sure.
it's just a part of a daily life. And so maybe Carlitos, you know, would have actually surprised us and not held on to the ring of power. They would have dropped
Mm.
Mount Doom, so to speak. And um, Mordor, that is. And um, I don't, why is it easy to, or not easy? Why in these carnal terms? In some ways, because I write so much about politics and because there is, as you say, a thesis sort of in my work, I don't want it to feel like a screed. I don't want
Yeah.
people to think that they're being lectured to for 150 pages. And nothing like sex and humor to undercut that. And so to me, it was a little bit of both. Within sex, there's power struggles, but the very nature of there being so much sex, effectively like an international brothel there happening, or sex club, really. I think, yeah, I think that made the rest of it not just more palatable, but entertaining.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think well, kind of I guess on the topic of public health crises and the individual versus the collective and power and its sort of siren-like abilities. I want to talk about another health issue you identify in this book, which is aspiration. Aspiration. The middle class is a public health. Wow, is it a public health issue? I think it's one of our most pressing issues, is the sort of like the culture of it and the desire to be a part of it, the safety that it promises and that it some way communicates, but in many ways it is a brutal environment. Um, there are some stories in this collection that address this topic head on, such as the Midtown West Side story piece. I just absolutely love that story. The parents getting trapped in that MLM kind of scheme, and the Six Times of Alan, which is also very funny and very sort of a very sagacious story. But yeah, the theme percolates throughout practically every piece in this collection. Characters who are outsiders by virtue of race, sexuality, or immigration status desire entry into the middle class's inner sanctum, only to find how hostile and alienating a place it is when they finally get there, if they get there. And we could also say like, does anyone get? But we don't have to even go there. And so I'm like curious if like, can you talk more about this theme's provenance for you as a writer?
Well, it's very personal to me. It's I am the son of working class immigrants, and we grew up in that kind of middle place between poverty and working class, I guess, when they used to be different categories. And so we struggled. There was a lot of financial struggle, and therefore there was a lot of stress. And I was raised to believe that there was nothing more important than social mobility. My parents
Mhm.
wouldn't have put it in those terms, but definitely it was like get the most education possible,
Mhm.
save, put a mortgage, get your mortgage, lined up, buy, get married, buy a car, save, 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 save. Nothing more important than that. Don't end up like us.
Mhm.
That was sort of the message that I heard growing up. And anything less than that would have, I think, I believed would be failure. And then I more or less succeeded. I more or less did everything that my parents asked, and it worked out well for me. And I have to be honest with you, it's kind of freaking lonely. It's not fun to succeed if everyone around you is suffering still. Okay. It's not fun to be able to buy whatever you want, or not even that, like not have to look at the price of grapes when you go to the store,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Uh, I remember there was a time when I was a kid and I was so attuned to the price of every single thing that we bought. And at some point, I don't know when, 30s, 40s, I stopped paying attention. I remember every time I wrote a check in my 20s, fearing it was going to bounce. Even though I had money in the bank, I still just lived in fear. I would like double check the balance because that's how we grew up. Checks bouncing all the time, return checks, fights at home, utilities being shut off. And anyway, this isn't meant to be woe is me. It's just meant to say that's not how this should work. That a
Right,
handful of us get to move up the ladder. Like we need to be thinking about how we change society to collapse the hierarchy across the board so everybody moves up at once. And so these stories I think are meant to highlight both the real struggle that leads people to want to climb the social ladder, and then the reality of being on sort of on the top rung by yourself, or
mm,
feeling by yourself. And if you don't have your community with you, it's bittersweet. And then people are like, oh well, but you can help you, there's only so many people you can help. You have to be a billionaire to be able to help everyone in your life.
yeah.
And so, yeah, it's not a sustainable way to be. And in fact, I argue anytime someone gives me a mic that I think you have one shot in this country. The
Mm,
immigrant generation gets here, they don't necessarily or typically um, concern themselves with the politics of the country. They just want to put their heads down, get the work done, make sure their children succeed. Do they experience racism? Yes. Sexism, all the things, but they have a protective barrier. And also, there's this like feeling of I'm a guest here, so I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to rock the boat. I don't see the world the way they see it. I don't fully understand. Yes, I've experienced racism, but this is a different racism, and I don't really
right.
know it. And so then you just keep moving and trudging along, and then your kids have to succeed because if they don't, what happens is now they are stuck, but without any of those same protective barriers because they don't feel like guests. So now there is a bit of entitlement, and in addition to that, like a heaviness to the lack of success. It's like a depression almost, like I missed my chance. I didn't get off the interstate in time, and so now I'm going to be looping this quagmire forever. And I believe the science, like the studies of generations, bears that out. I mean, I can't cite anything in this moment, but I'm fairly certain that that's the way it is. So if you don't make it, you're not going to make it, and then your kids are less likely to make it, and so on and so forth.
And it's like, God, I'm actually imagining the New Jersey Turnpike, which ties into the the New York question I want to ask you. But yeah, it would be a hellacious quagmire to keep looping. I'm wondering though, too, like, I'm thinking like you're talking about this phenomenon of kind of never being able, really never being able to have your cake, much less eat it too, right? There's just, as you said, there's these sort of benefits. I mean, kind of notionally, but like to being a guest, right? Keeping your head down, working so that your kids can be successful. But then your happiness hinges, of course, upon the kid's success. And then say you are the successful kid, right? You fulfill the parent's dream, but then you find yourself in kind of a lonely milieu. And so there's like some amount of alienation in both cases, but I think like I mean, this is going back to the individual versus collective stuff. I'm thinking of the kind of internal monologue that the main character has in the Six Times of Alan when he sees this building just collapses. It's parts of it. No one's hurt, but it's just kind of this like standard New York BS. And everyone keeps going about their day, and he's like, man, like I feel really alienated from where I am in life and from my surroundings, and this is extremely challenging. And I don't have the community that would bring me joy here. I'm wondering, like, is there an extent to which external circumstances determining one's well-being and like that the condition of that, the fact of that can be balanced with the joy that could be found in it, in like material circumstances that are certainly not, Elon Musk's, right? Like, but like, can there be a balance of like recognition of scarcity or recognition of anomie or alienation and joy coming from a different source? Because sometimes, like, when I've experienced my own, again, my own versions, my own intersections of this stuff as well, but like, I wonder too, how it's so hard to determine the course of the external real. This is the tension of your book. You can't make the external reality be the thing you need it to be, right? So where is the joy to be gotten? Is there joy to be gotten? Is there a balance there?
I initially asked my editor, Danny Vasquez at Astra House, if we could italicize the word report in the title, the people who report more stress, because some of it was the self consciousness, my own, but of the narrators, that I would in any way be equating the stress of an upper middle class professor who deals with isms, but who has wealth and opportunities and success with the oppression that many other groups in this country or people face. And so what I wanted to note was that you report it because he has an awareness of what's happening. And that awareness, that double consciousness in a way, right? To be like, I'm functioning here, but I know what's happening all at all times. And
Right.
to let it go so that you can't either enjoy life or you can. And so I think, and I don't know if I do a great job of this in the book, but personally, I believe, yes, it is possible to find joy. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a life worth living. But
Exactly. Yeah.
I think there's nothing, absolutely nothing more important than being with people and
Hmm.
laughing and eating together. A crowded dinner table is very, very important in capitalism because the rest of the it's one of the few places I think where we can counteract what capitalism is telling us to do to ourselves and to each other all day long, which is like atomize, take care of
Yeah.
yourself first. Do not consider the other person. Don't give this person. I mean, there are laws that prevent you from like lending money, right? Like you have to pay a tax. So there's just like we've been forced into a way in which like profit is more important than anything. And at the dinner table, this is what I practice. Um, we come together and at least for a little bit, either we commiserate, we forget, we have fun, we fight, but we're together, and there's sort of an evenness there. That is a microcosm of what we need to be doing at a structural level, which is again sort of like a broken record, but collapse the hierarchy so that everyone is at the same level. And um, and there are many different ways to get there, whether it's like wage controls or reparations or an increase in minimum wage or universal amenities or just more egalitarian benefits for society. But yeah, I it's too bad. I would say that in the last 10 years, most of the joy I find is commiserating about the misery with or commiserating with my friends, right? But there's joy there because we're doing it together, whether it's at a
Yeah.
protest or at a dinner table or in a theater. We are together, and yeah, I can't underscore that enough because if the world does not change fast enough, and it hasn't, all we can do to stay healthy and alive is be there for each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that like creating one's own like microcosmic, anti-hierarchical, anarchic, whatever space
Yeah.
is of utmost importance. Totally. Actually. I wouldn't, it's a bit of a shift of gears, but yes and no. Let me ask the New York question because New York is very anarchic and extremely rigid and hierarchical. Um, but I would be totally remiss if I didn't describe this book whose cover I'm going to show again, as if we have a commercial break. If I didn't describe this as a very New York book. And like, not, of course, New York in the sense of, oh, I'm here. I just did my MFA and now I live here. And now I live in, whatever this really gentrified part of Queens. But it's like New York. It's like Deborah Eisenberg. In fact, the story, there's a story with a character, a kind of an older gay man who passes away named Artie in his like late 80s. And Artie in his rent-controlled, condo, he could have been Deborah Eisenberg's friend. Like he could have been Fran Lebowitz's friend. Like it's there are a lot of sort of like characters and kind of memories of the city that really evoked for me like this kind of old school Eisenbergian, like it's hard to characterize any time as really pre-gentrification. I guess if we go back to Boss Tweed, maybe, but yeah, there's a sense that like this is a city that's like eminently lived in for you. We're not just like on the brunch level here. I was reminded also of like, William Maxwell, Jonathan Letham's writing on New York's is so lovely. And it feels just like this like pleasantly engaging labyrinth. Like, there's a sense that you just know the place and love the place in a way that is rarely I feel represented as I hate to use this term, but authentically in fiction as it is in this book. So I really, I'm curious if you could talk about like being a New Yorker, being a New York writer, especially in this age of gentrified literature, right? Like the kind of the algorithm in Amazon, and of course gentrified boroughs with all the Pilates places.
Shout out to Pilates, which I love and is doing.
Pilates is great. Yeah. No,
Um,
I'm not trying to
no,
not.
no.
But
um, well, I have to be honest with you. I'm very grateful that you felt that way after reading my work because I am a walking I love New York shirt. I am a huge fan. I was born
yeah.
in New York. I have spent most of my life in New York City,
Mm,
born in New York City, and but then moved to the suburbs at a young age, and then came right back as soon as I could,
mm,
as I turned of age. And and I think it's also like the United Nations, a place with so much lost potential. You know,
mm.
everything
Yeah.
we have everything we need here. Everything we need is here in abundance. And the way we misallocate resources and the way we mistreat each other and dehumanize one another is so frustrating. It is
Yeah.
so horrific. I hate it so much. And I don't get me started on the NYPD budget, which is bigger than like the GDP for many small countries.
Yeah.
It is disgusting. And the I can't even say that it's ignorance at this point or lack of like knowledge of history. It's
Mm,
almost like wanton disregard for human solutions. And we know what could work. We know that redistribution of resources and wealth in a city like this, in the moments when it has been more evenly distributed, we've had a happier, healthier population. That goes for anywhere in the world, really. But we just pretend that out of nowhere we've all gone crazy and we need to lock people up and that'll solve everything. And it never does. As if locking people up were free. Um, in any case, I love New York so much and it drives me crazy at all times. The
yeah.
gentrification, the inefficiencies, the mess, the smells, the you name it. But I also love it. And it's all I've ever known. And I love being in a melting pot like this and being able to go to a restaurant for almost any cuisine in the world,
Yes.
you
Oh
know,
man.
any given day or street. Uh, But I think I also love explaining, it's a myth to me that New York City is like, we are preternaturally um, liberal or open-minded.
Mhm.
No, what we are is a collection of a lot of transplants, minus the indigenous folks, and
Mhm.
um, and we are so dense that it's not that like I was born and I'm like, I'm cool with everything. No, you're just rubbing up against that person on the subway. And so you
Mhm.
do that every single day, 2 or 3 times a day for 25 years, or even just 1 year. Suddenly you're like, oh, that's a human. You demystify everything. You
Yeah.
demystify everything in the subway. It all
Yeah.
happens,
That's
which
a
makes me
yeah.
so sad that the sort of the handful of like pretty horrific crimes that have happened since the pandemic, which again, why does anyone be like, maybe it had something to do with this unique universal experience um, that is causing all this. And that people are now afraid to get on the subways, and ridership it's been on the uptick, but it decreased heavily after during the pandemic and then immediately afterwards because of these handfuls of crimes. And that's really frustrating because that is again, it's a little bit like a dinner table, and phones have really ruined that because we used to interact more on the subway. And um and that, yeah, that is a shame. We used to interact everywhere more in New York City. To me, New York City, what I remember is 9/11. What I remember is being on a plane years before that, coming back from Colombia, where the wing went on fire and the JFK. And typical New Yorkers, everyone was like afraid and then making jokes about it immediately. The tail of the plane was hanging out of the tower. I remember I was working 2 blocks away and I was standing with a group of people who were smoking cigarettes at the base of the skyscraper where I was working at the time. And like typical New Yorkers, they were like, "What an idiot! That freaking guy flew the plane. What an idiot!" And I could hear the people laughing and smoking and we didn't know what was coming. And I believe a combination of 9/11 and cell phones have changed the culture of New York. I'm starting to sound like Fran Lebowitz, but have changed the culture of New York in a way that makes it shittier. We just
Yeah.
used to laugh more with each other and take the indignities and the calamities in stride in a way. And it's harder to do that when you're here on the phone.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
love my phone, and I'm one of those people too. So I'm not judging. I'm just saying I have noticed this trend away from collective or communal sort of, um, you know, blanking on the word, but yeah, just analysis and observation of the moment, of the day to day. And that was always very typical of New York. Everyone in each other's business and collectively like laughing or lambasting something happening in the vicinity. Happens sometimes still. We're not so far gone. But yeah, so to me, New York is like a place of lost potential. And I believe we can still turn it around. I know we can turn it around. And we have right now, for example, a candidate for mayor, Zoran Mamdani, who is in second place. And Cuomo is not just in the lead financially and in the polls, but he also has that annoying thing that for most humans is like name recognition. It goes so freaking far. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it pains me because I believe we're going to make a choice between someone who is going to keep the city as it is, and whose only whose only bona fides right now are that people think he's going to be just as much of a bully as Trump is. And but two bullies fighting each other is a spectacle. It's not a plan for a city or a people. Anyway, my point is that I still think we can turn it around, and New York City could live up to its reputation as the best city in the world. It needs to be more even. It cannot be that I live on one of the richest blocks in Brooklyn and I can see out my window 2 blocks away one of the second poorest census tract in New York City, which, by the way, where Sigrid Nunez, I just found out recently, was born, the writer.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty cool. But yeah, and so that inequality and that frustration and that possibility is what keeps me writing about New York. And I see it in all the interactions. I see it all the time between everyone. You know,
I mean, the New York as like this term feels so outmoded, but like as the actual kind of like American utopian melting pot place. My family's, I have family from Queens, Flushing, and they, like second and third generation Russian Jews. And like that whole kind of like what you just said about like the rubbing up against each other in the subway, right? It was like New York is a place, or used to be rather, a place where you were confronted with humanity in ways I think both, yeah, gentle and abrasive. And that's what I so love about the Eisenbergian, like the old school writing about New York, and I think like your stories kind of take that similar direction of like this city is like this like kind of fascinating labyrinth. It's not like I'm not like checking in here on social media, like I'm not like it's so I yeah, it's such a kind of I think there has been something lost, but I agree with you that there's something to be regained through politics, maybe, but and also, of course, the scene very well, but also like I think through art, most notably, and of course not the like the Met and the Guggenheim, but like the kind of art we're talking about here, right? The dinner, the kind of the what comes up at the dinner table. And yeah, that's where I sort of see that. And we could also turn the conversation to activism as well, right? Because you're talking about organizing, and I think organizing is kind of like a fundamental aspect of like collectivism, right? The how do we kind of mobilize folks to believe in a cause? And your book, I mean, in any discussion of New York, right, it's going to be hard not to, and queerness or gay men specifically, who are the kind of the main protagonists of your short stories here. It's impossible not to talk about ACT UP, and the AIDS epidemic, I think, and especially if we're talking about, like issues of, broadly speaking, public health, social inequality, sex, vectors of infection, and we could talk about both infection by disease and beliefs. Um, it feels like an important thing to address. And I felt like it was like creeping into some of the stories, right? It's not the subject matter, but the idea of both the kind of like the threat, the past threat of it, the organizing around it, I think was there. And you could also say that a lot of the stories like really set in the present, which is the most of them. Characters are just recovering from the Reagan years. I think everyone's kind of getting over that still, and I'm really curious about how like these like do these topics like are they do you feel they're like influencing or even overshadowing some of the themes you're writing about, or do you feel like, well, like where do they come in for you?
The fear of them overshadowing is there for me for sure.
Sure.
And I think some of the criticism I have received about my work is that it does become a didactic, and
Mhm.
that maybe I don't do enough with the narrators or my characters to undercut the political messaging. But I say this in my new book. I don't give a fuck. The world is on fire, and I can only write about so many pages about the contours of a leaf and the undulations in the horizon. All
Yeah.
beautiful, but
All
like, but I'm in public health. There's this idea that like every audience needs a different type of message. So you tailor your message
Mhm.
to your audiences. Some people do really well with the images of like corroded gums in order to quit smoking.
Mhm.
Fear-based PSAs work well. Some people need a kind person to explain to them. Some people need their doctor to be the source of their medical information. Some people need a trusted aunt. Um, there are people in this world who need and want to read stories where the wall is broken and where ideas, as you say, are spelled out. And that's my lane. And I believe there was more of this in the past. And I believe a lot of MFA programs, from what I've read, have kind of turned away from the political novels
Yeah.
and have encouraged their students to turn away from them. And I didn't get an MFA, so I didn't have that influence, although the products of those MFAs have been influencing me all my life too. But I just feel like there's a lot to say, and I want to say it in a narrative form because I like entertaining people. I like telling stories. I like the creativity of it all, but I don't have time to I I don't have time to walk away from the urgency of the moment either. So I'm doing my best to braid all of these things. And um, I forgot the first part of your question, but
The way AIDS was coming in specifically, maybe also right. Yeah.
right. So I guess hmm, for me, ACT UP represents something very, very unique in the
Mhm.
history of social movements. There is someone, of course, with who studies these social movements who could contradict me immediately, but I can't think of another movement in recent times where the the outcome was certain death in such a short period of time, right? Like the what they were fighting against, that the motivating factor was certain death,
Yeah.
and a horrific certain death. And
Yes.
so and such a politically, more so than most, not everyone, such a politically powerful group of people to begin with, right?
Sure.
It's very difficult. The reason that ACT UP was so, as successful as it was, I think, is because the motivation of death, right? Certain death, plus the resources at hand in that population. It's very
Yeah.
hard to create those conditions. You can have Black Lives Matter, you could feasibly argue that it's like one death at a time, police brutality, structural injustice, racism, all of it for sure. But it's not like we know for sure in 6 months you are going to die. It's a
Right.
and then it's not so okay. You do have this motivation of like death, seeing what happened to George Floyd. You know, that was such a catalyzing moment in American history, and to move and for Black Lives Matter, and
Sure.
but not the same amount of resources, right? It wasn't a group of most like the face of it wasn't powerful white men who had money and disposable income and
Mhm.
parents, connections to politicians. Yeah, times have changed, so it wasn't like there wasn't some of that, but it's different. And so um, I am always thinking about how do we recreate the urgency of like certain death to motivate people. And I think in a way, climate change could be that thing, right? Because but it's still, it's like there we can see it, and the fires are happening, and now the newspapers are looking like an inconvenient truth all the time, but it still isn't AIDS anyway. So that's why ACT UP is has been so important to me over the years, because the ways in which people who were affected by the injustice banded together and fought against the injustice, and did it because if they didn't, they were going to die, and so many did, is a kind of a unique moment in our history. I don't know if I've answered your question,
No,
but
you have. I think like because I think the this is weird, but I'm almost reminded of like the airborne toxic event in White Noise. When the narrator, Don DeLillo's narrator, learns, for listeners who may or may not have read this, he learns that he's like breathed in this like, oh, really scary, whatever gaseous smog thing. And he goes and he talks to the nurse and he's like, I breathe this in. And she's like, oh my God, you're 55 years old. It means that like when you breathe this thing in, it's gonna kill you over a period of 30 years. So when you're 85, you're gonna die, and it's this kind of sort of absurd thing of like, well, like, yeah, I mean, yes, like this could be the cause, but also the inevitability of death. And I think that with AIDS, the acceleration of death, and yes, the sort of it's almost like the medieval, like bubonic horrors of AIDS, like it really kind of brought death into the lives of young folks for whom that was not, in their minds. And I think that like, yeah, ACT UP to me also represents that kind of accelerated organizing. And the way I see AIDS and ACT UP showing up in your book, it's not just through the mentions, right? It's through this sense of like proximity to it's like alternating sort of like proximity to mortality or to disease or to like really intense kind of like depression and insulation from it. And so I think like, if we're talking about public health issues and we're talking about how, again, how do we mitigate the individual and the tensions between the individual and the collective? How do we like ensure as many people as possible live as long and healthily as they can? There are just sort of just like these like strange compromises and these strange sacrifices that like both of your characters make, and I think that we like find ourselves making in real life that surprise us. And ACT UP, like for me, like yeah, just like what you said, it represented like we cannot compromise. We are going to die in 6 months. But then at the same time, how long did it take Ronald Reagan to say the word AIDS? There's this whole sort of like get the garish reality of the thing. And so, yeah, I understand that like maybe people have lobbed that criticism at you of like, oh, you're writing too politically. And I would even just say of your work, like, it's a big dinner table. There are novels of ideas that can be at the dinner table, and there's a novel that can describe the gorgeous undulations of waves in the ocean. It's all so necessary. And I think there's an immediacy to both. And that argument is not a strained one. I think that like yeah, there's an immediacy to organizing. There's an immediacy to appreciating beauty. If we're all breathing in the airborne toxic event, right? And like death is inevitable, why not find the joy? Why not find the joy right now? Why not have now be the time we're finding the joy? Now be the time we're starting to organize. And your book makes those cases.
I like that. I like that. And I also believe strongly um, that organizing and fighting oppression is an empowering,
Yeah.
is an empowering intervention.
Mhm.
Um, and it's sucks to have to do that work in your lifetime, to have to fight for basic human respect. But there's New York in the background. Um, but it
New York is it a character in this interview?
it's there. And then to answer your question earlier about Reagan, I mean, yes, Reagan uh, was a piece of shit, and his policies, like many presidents after him, the tax cuts, we have not recovered from them. We have not
Yeah,
recovered from those tax cuts,
we
and
really have not.
I in this book, but in everything I write, I talk about this sort of immigrant community who couldn't do for their kids, and so then you have these kids who have these regrets and hangups and gripes with like, and and instead of taking it on their parents, I think it's just more useful for people to be like, what were the material conditions of the time that put people in these situations? Which isn't to forgive and to say, hey, okay, you didn't do anything wrong, right? But it's also to say to yourself, if you are a child, a working class kid at a certain time, or a child that grew up impoverished or destitute, you definitely dealt with shit and it fucked you up. And the question is, would you have dealt with the same shit fucked up if Reagan hadn't, pushed for those tax cuts, if the Republican Congress hadn't passed? Like, that is a valid question, because if they hadn't, the world would be different. Our society would be different.
Yeah.
And your parents would have had more time. They wouldn't have been so angry. They would have been able to pay the bills, and they would have, instead of working extra days, they would have been able to sit with you and do homework with you. So, that all trickled down. That's the trickle down that I think of when I think of Reagan, because it wasn't the people, the wealth trickle down. It was the misery trickle down.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this actually is the most opportune time to pivot to my final substantive question. My penultimate question, but this is the final sort of like meteor one. The white man, as long as we're talking about Reagan, let's talk about white men. He shows up throughout your book as the sometimes clueless but ultimately loving spouse, you have the Gus figure, as the doofy but not unhelpful psychotherapist, as the charmingly buffoonish hookup. Only occasionally does the white man materialize as out and out bigot. And I found myself appreciating this. Like one thing your book does so well, I know I've said this before, is like you've assigned yourself the task of grappling with social inequality. But you also like don't let things be too simple. And so you do the point where you're kind of like writing from the point of view of the white dude various times. And I just wondering if you could discourse a little bit
Yeah.
on the white dude before we go.
Yeah. The Brads and the therapists.
Brads and the therapists. Yeah.
Well, I think that is also part of white supremacy is that you find yourself looking up to ideas and the people who embody those values and ideas and aesthetics. And without even realizing it, you can hate them on the one hand and then admire and aspire on the other. And and then as you move up, there's just the sort of practical thing. Like if you're a broke brown kid, and then you end up in an Ivy League school, guess what? There are going to be a lot of white people. Your roommate's going to be white. Your teacher's going to be white. Some of your best friends are going to be white. Your frat brothers are going to be white. I mean, not for everyone, but it increases the likelihood. And so suddenly, like the archetype that you're supposed to hate is also sometimes your best friend and your lover and your pal and your ally, right? And your
Yeah.
mentor.
Yeah.
Oh, complicated. And your mentor. And so then you're like, oh shit, we're all just humans, and race is a social construct. And I've spent so much energy hating a social construct. And this is still a human. And then also like protect yourself because power above all, So life is can be that. It can be this cycle of again contradictions and confusion around how to relate to people. And so yeah, I don't throw baby out with bathwater. I try not to, and I like to talk about the complications um, that have been imposed upon us. Because if they had not been imposed upon us, we wouldn't think twice about who we socialize with and how and what that means.
Yeah.
It is because of these hierarchies that we have to like overthink and defend and protect and worry about all of this stuff. And so, yes, what are people with power doing to draw attention to the lack of redistribution and the inequities of the world? But also, they're still people and humans, and so yeah, I try to capture a little bit of it all. Yeah.
I thank you so much for that, Alejandro. I know you have to go. So I'll ask one final thing, which is that normally, we do like a word of advice at the very end, but instead of like a whole, multiple sentences, leave us with a literal word of advice. What is the one word that you want the listeners to just take away from this conversation? It could be anything. It could be block or tree or banana, anything. And then I will send you off into that good afternoon, that New York afternoon.
Um,
The single word.
Single word. What pressure? Uh,
Just free association.
Dinner.
I love that. Oh, that's perfect. Dinner, 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 and collectivism, and pre-order middle spoon, and read this book. Read Alejandro's first book. Thank you so much, my friend, for coming on the show. And yeah, I very much look forward to reading everything you publish in the future.
Amazing. That goes both ways. You are such a thoughtful interviewer. This was a fantastic time.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Appreciate it. Goodbye, friend.